Entry 40. I need to get out of here, but where am I gonna go? Damn it. I woke up about 20 minutes ago. Not sure how long I've been out, but it's dark outside right now. And I can hear something outside. It sounds like laughter. Not human, though. It's so strange. It seems to come in bursts, and the voice is so guttural. It knows I'm in here. Why else would it have stopped right in front of the cabin? Screw this damn place. It's been hard to admit, but I've been deluding myself this whole time. This desire for adventure, it's all bullshit. It wasn't at the beginning, but things have changed. I want to go home, but if this really is Earth in the future, then maybe home doesn't exist at all. I just heard something else. It sounds like gunshots and yelling. The laughter's only getting louder now. Entry 41. So, a lot's happened. I don't know if I could call myself safe or not, but it's sure as hell better than being stuck in that cabin. The commotion outside went on for another few minutes before some guy burst in, rifles aimed right at me. The commotion outside went for another few minutes before some guys burst in, rifles aimed right at me. They must have been in their late teens. I didn't know how to react at first. I thought I was dead. However, they seemed as surprised as I was. After asking me some questions that I didn't really know how to answer, they destroyed some floorboards and fished out what I assumed were cartons of ammunition from underneath. They told me to come with them, and we hopped into an extremely run-down dune buggy before driving off. Before we left, I got a glimpse of what had been making those laughing noises, and God, I really wish I hadn't. It looked like a giant spider with too many legs, but with a human face. As we drove through the desolate, hellish landscape, I asked one of them what the hell this place was. I expected him to be surprised at me asking such a seemingly ridiculous question. However, he didn't seem to hesitate. Heaven's curse, that's what they call it anyways. In other words, this is hell, he told me. I didn't get any of their names. They never bothered telling me. Right now, I'm inside some kind of walled outpost. I don't know how many people are here. Must be thousands, though. The weird thing is, most of them are children, and nobody looks past 40. I didn't get much of an introduction. Everything's moving so fast right now. I keep asking everybody what this place is, but nobody seems to want to talk to me. Heaven's curse, Station 26, I only ever get vague names. At this point, I've come to the conclusion that I must have been teleported. That device the soldiers threw, it must have taken me somewhere else. But where? Probably just another island. But it doesn't look like I'm getting a straight answer anytime soon. Right as I entered through the gates, I was gestured up to a guard tower and told that I was to be a lookout from now on. What am I supposed to be looking for? I asked them. Anything that gets too close. Use this radio to contact somebody on the ground. Well, shit, I thought. Let me describe the place a bit better. You know how before there was fog so thick I couldn't see shit right in front of me? Well, most of it seems to have dissipated around here. It's still present, but not enough to cause a considerable nuisance. The unexplainable part stems from the fact that there seems to be a barrier in which the fog is either heavy or light. In other words, there's literally a massive wall of fog that stretches up into the clouds, sitting just a few hundred meters away from the barrier walls. Speaking of the walls, they look like they've gone through absolute hell. They seem to be made out of hardened mud, and it stretches upwards around 30 meters. From where we're positioned in on the towers, we can just see over it, enough to make out the vast, expansive desert in front of us. The outpost itself gives off a post-nuclear apocalypse steampunk vibe. What I assume are the soldiers or guards here wear really archaic-looking scrap metal armor and use these firearms that appear to be powered by steam. The buildings here are mostly in shambles. There's a multitude of extremely run-down factories and buildings that are just dismantled for resources. Almost everybody sleeps underground in these crudely dug-out bunkers. And safe to say, it isn't exactly a paradise here. In addition to all of that, the food situation is horrific, but I guess that's been a constant, so I can't be too surprised. It's not even that I'm starving, but my diet has turned into one consisting solely of tree bark and cooked insects. I never thought I'd miss energy bars. I'm currently doing 14-hour shifts. There's a few guys up here with me, but like everybody else, they don't seem to be the talkative type. I'd like to say that it's mostly uneventful, but it really isn't. Almost every 2 hours, I see things. Now, I've encountered a lot of creatures throughout the past years, but the shit I've seen just a few days of being here, it's something else entirely. Most of the time, they're quite far away, but every once in a while, they get a little close for comfort. That's when we have to use the radio. Just yesterday, we witnessed something in the distance past the wall of fog. At first, I thought it was some sort of aircraft. How wrong I was. The other two guys here with me seemed to know exactly what was going on, because they freaked out and started screaming into the radios. "The harbingers incoming!" Confused beyond relief, I asked them what the hell they were talking about, but they didn't even need to answer for me. As soon as the question came out of my mouth, they broke through the fog. I guess the best way I can describe them are small dragons? But as it got closer and closer, I realized that it was a lot worse than what I had initially thought. It had these sharp spikes sticking out from all over its body, and I mean all over. None of them were the same size either. I barely had time to process this before it flew right into our tower and shredded the two guys I was working with. It set its gaze towards me before I was bombarded by a medley of firepower below. It flew down, barely sparing me from death. It took a while, but they finally killed the thing. It must have taken out at least 15 people, though, before it finally went down. I expected everybody to be relieved after that, but they just remained more on guard than ever. I soon realized why. I looked back out into the sandy plain. Another familiar shape had materialized just beyond the fog. But this time, it was followed by more. I radioed them and started scrambling down the ladder. And staying there would have been a death sentence. I'm not so proud of what I did next. As I hit the ground, one of the guards tossed me a rifle. I guess he was expecting me to help out in the oncoming attack. I stayed for a while. I truly, really did. But after witnessing the winged monstrosities tear apart human flesh like it was nothing, and the subsequent bullets of my low-powered firearm chipping away slowly and slowly at the creature's horrendous spikes, I'd had enough. I ran for shelter. I found a locker in one of the factories and hid there until the sounds of the carnage stopped. When I finally came out, I was inundated with the sight of mangled limbs, both human and not, strewn everywhere. I feared dirty looks as soon as I came out, but nobody seemed to glance my way. I guess they didn't notice my act of cowardice during the action. I watched as several guards dragged the Harbinger corpses away, tossing them down what looked to be a large well. Even after that grisly event, nothing changed. I just got my new watchtower partners and everything went back to normal. Nobody's even talking about it. This kind of shit must happen often. Hell. Entry 42. Well, things just keep getting more and more interesting. The day right after the Harbingers incident, there was another attack. This time, I was right in the thick of it. I was sleeping when it happened. A guard shook me awake sometime in the middle of the night and shoved a rifle into my arms. "We need every person out there," was what I think he said. Seeing no way out of it this time, I simply obliged. As I stepped out of my small bunker, I was blasted with the sound of combat. I surveyed everything, searching for the invaders. Now, I know that I really shouldn't be surprised at anything I see anymore, but I still flinched at the sight of them. They looked like knights? That's the best way I can describe them, but not regular ones. Their armor was pitch black, as if it completely absorbed any light that managed to hit it. They were also extremely large. I caught the full scale of their size when one nearly snuck up beside me. It jabbed its pike towards me, barely missing my head. They were also extremely large. I caught the full scale of their size when one nearly snuck up beside me. It jabbed its pike towards me, barely missing my head. I looked up at the towering monstrosity in front of me. While it was completely covered in the armor, there were cracks and holes everywhere. I could see its skin through them. It looked to be like a rotting gray. And the mouth, oh God. Its helmet covered the entire face, but the mouth was left exposed. The teeth were long and jagged, in addition to being dark red. There was also no skin around its lips. I was transfixed for a second before coming to my senses. I aimed the rifle directly at the creature and blew its jaw off. But that didn't even seem to slow it down. It kept advancing, thrusting the rusty pike at me every chance it got. I got another shot off at its helmet, which seemed to disorient it enough for me to escape. As I ran, I looked around and realized that this was a losing battle. The humans were dropping like flies and getting torn apart by these abominations before being eaten by them. But that wasn't even the worst part. The walls were breaking apart, the knights pouring in at a torrid rate. I don't even know how many there were. Too many to handle for sure. I even saw some harbingers flying around, as well as what looked like those fiery skeletons on horses. I knew this wasn't going to end well. I decided to take refuge in a random bunker. I snuck my way down there, expecting a bunch of others to have already been hiding. But there were only a few guys there. They looked surprised as they saw me, but eventually gestured for me to come towards them. Hesitantly, I did. "We gotta get out of here," one of them said. The other one broke apart a section of the wall, revealing a narrow tunnel. "Emergency escape, let's go." I asked them where it was supposed to take us. They just shook their heads and responded in unison. "I don't know." They disappeared into the tunnel soon after. I thought about it for a while before hearing the bunker door crash down above me. There were no other options here. I grabbed a small bag containing my belongings and I rushed after them. The problem with the tunnel was that it remained pitch black the entire way. I couldn't see where I was going. Luckily for me, it didn't seem to branch off and I was able to follow the footsteps in front of me. After maybe 10 minutes of running, I finally spotted the next exit up ahead. I burst out, looking for the two other guys I had been following, but that's when I realized something. I was back out into the fog. Again, I could barely see in front of me. I heard some footsteps in the distance, but knew that it would be impossible to locate them. I was back to square one. This time, however, at least I had a rifle. I counted 4 more shots. I started walking aimlessly, looking for something. At one point, I stumbled upon and almost fell into what appeared to be a boiling river. However, as I got closer, I realized that that wasn't the case. There were small creatures erratically moving around in the water, and kind of like how piranhas do when you drop meat near them. But these were a lot worse than piranhas. When I peered over to see what was going on, a few lunged at me. I moved out of the way just in time and they landed in the dry sand. I got a good look at them while they flopped around. They were hard to describe, like a lobster squid mutation with too many mouths. Safe to say, I found another way around. I don't know how long I walked, probably only for half a day, but it felt like weeks. Luckily, I'd packed a jug of water beforehand. I saw a lot of shit out there. I think that if I was transported here directly from Earth, I probably would have died in the first few minutes. But I seem to have adapted to hostile landscapes rather well. I managed to avoid any confrontations. The fog made it easier. A few times, I inadvertently caught the attention of the entities that roam this place. But I'd learned that if I buried myself in the sand well enough, they wouldn't find me. These things were dumb as a box of rocks. It was when the fog finally dissipated where problems arose. At one point, I'd stumbled upon what seemed to be railroad tracks. Thinking they'd have to lead somewhere, I followed them. As I kept walking, I noticed that the fog was starting to thin out around me. But that also came with the revelation that the desert wasn't as sparse as I thought it was. When the fog disappeared completely, I was suddenly thrust into the center of attention of every creature in my vicinity, and there were a lot of them. The good news was that I also saw something else in the distance. A wall. This time, it looked like stone. There were also armed guards on top of them. For a brief second, I made eye contact with one of them. At first, I wasn't sure if they were hostile or not. I got my answer when they shot what looked like a large scorpion that started charging towards me. I started running like hell towards the barricade, nearly slipping in the sand a few times. If the guards weren't helping me out every step of the way, I would have been a goner in the first few seconds. As I got closer, I saw a small opening begin to materialize in the wall. I just ran even harder. I barely escaped, stumbling in as the entrance closed behind me. Unfortunately, one of the creatures also leaked in. It looked like a ghoulish, feral woman with giant, empty eye sockets. It started choking me, but was shot down by something behind me. I turned around, coming face to face with a large, burly man in tactical gear. He introduced himself as Crane, a soldier living in the settlement. As he showed me around the place, I realized that it must have been an old military base. There were tanks, hangars, warehouses, weapon depots, all of that shit. There also aren't that many people here, and even stranger, barely any women. Crane sighed as I pointed it out. Yeah, I don't know what's going on. There used to be a lot of them, but they've all been dying. Must be something in the water here, or the air. Who the fuck knows with this place? He didn't elaborate any further, almost like he didn't want to think about the grim implications of what that might mean for the place. In fact, they were ecstatic whenever they encountered a new person out in the desert. They weren't lacking resources, they were lacking a population. It sure as hell seems a lot more secure than the settlement I was just in, though. They even have explosives here. Unsurprisingly, I was immediately assigned to be a soldier as well. I have guard duty tomorrow, back to that shit. At least my bed here is relatively comfortable, and the food isn't terrible either. They've actually managed to farm livestock here. They look rather unsightly though, like mutated boars, but I can't really complain at this point. Overall, the place is decent. Well, as decent gets, I suppose. A strange thing to note here was what looked like a large pit in the middle of a pathway. It was barricaded somewhat haphazardly. I walked up to get a better look at it. I peered down, expecting to see a bottomless void, but I was met with something else. Almost like a thick, gray mist of sorts. It looked ominous as hell. I asked Crane about it, but he said he didn't know, that it's been here ever since he was. I'd stay away from it though. If that wasn't obvious, we hear noises coming out of it every so often. A lot of guys are scared something's gonna burst out of it one day. I mean, I'll take his advice. However, as I lie here, I ask myself if this is even worth living anymore. The people around me probably don't have these feelings. I mean, this is all they know. But I've experienced the past. The old mundane existence that I hated so much suddenly comes into perspective. We clawed ourselves out of the dark ages for a reason. Entry 43. Holy shit, I just discovered something big. The guys around here tend to crumple up old papers and throw them around for fun. As I was walking around, I noticed one on the ground. I picked it up, trying to get a closer look at it. That's when I realized that it was a newspaper? I opened it up, hoping to get a glimpse back into the old world. Maybe start piecing together what the hell happened. What I read shocked me to my core. I couldn't make out many words, but I got the important ones. It was the New York Times, dated June 2003. This was the headline. Cold War escalating to dangerous heights. Latest peace talks end in disaster. Felt by all fronts. The Cold War? I must have stared at that headline for about an hour. The article itself was unreadable, but I still couldn't believe it. Was this a parody newspaper? It looked real to me. If it wasn't, well, what the hell did that mean? After asking around, I found out that this place had been a library of sorts. A place where old books and records are stored. They said that if I wanted to find out more, to go there and talk to the guy running the place. That's where I'm headed right after I finish this. Holy shit. Entry 44. I had no idea what to expect from this library, but even that didn't stop me from feeling surprised when I finally saw it. Crane walked me over there after I had told him that I wanted to see it. On the rather long walk over there, he asked me about my past, what I'd been doing before meeting him. Now, it's obviously a long story and one that's quite hard to explain, but I gave him the gist of it. I told him about the Earth I knew, the clear skies, nature, civilizations, all of it. He probably thought I was mental, that I'd been through so much I created this fictitious utopia in my head. He didn't say any of it out loud, but I could tell that he didn't believe a single word. In all honesty, I couldn't care less, and none of it really mattered anyways. He led me to a singular, small, unassuming building surrounded by nothing. It almost looked like a ticket booth. I looked at him questioningly. He just gestured for me to go in. It's all in there, all that you want to know. The password is crisis. He walked away after saying that, leaving me alone to stare at the peculiar structure in front of me. I walked in through the small entryway and was faced with an opening in the floorboards. There was a ladder going downwards. I took it, descending into the darkness for about 20 minutes. As I hopped off of the last rung, I found myself in what looked like a lobby with metal walls and floors. In front of me were large iron doors with an alphabetical panel to the side. There were overhead lights, but they weren't on. Instead, everything was illuminated by large candles. I entered the password and they slid open. I can barely even begin to describe what I had seen. It was beautiful, to say the least. There were rows and rows of books and manuscripts stacked on pristine white shelves. There were breathtaking glass structures of historical figures set up on the sides and spiral staircases leading down to other floors. Again, the only sources of light here were candles and lamps, so it gave off an extremely ambient vibe that just made everything feel more stunning and surreal. I snapped back from my trance into reality when I heard a voice call out from somewhere behind me. I turned around, seeing a meek-looking 30-ish-year-old man staring at me in confusion. I struggled to spit out the words, but I finally got an introduction out. "I haven't seen you before," the man responded. "Yeah, I just got here, I suppose." He nodded. "Well, I'm Voynich." After that brief exchange, we just stared at each other for a while. Eventually, I piped back up. "So, what do you do?" He smirked, gesturing to the books around him. "I'm learning, constantly, piecing together the past, if you will." "It's just you here?" He nodded. "Didn't used to be. I had friends down here, but they're all gone. Monsters, disease, it's tough to survive, you know? And the guys on the surface, they all got bored of this place. Can't read too well either, so it's just me." "You said that you were piecing together the past. So, what happened?" He went on to explain everything to me. Well, everything that he's figured out from reading, archiving, and analyzing the books and documents down here anyways. Apparently, the Soviet Union never dissolved in 1991 here. You see, in this timeline, the USSR didn't only take over Eastern Europe. Most of the West also went with it. In other words, they didn't grow weaker over the years, only stronger. In the Cold War, it wasn't between the US. The Soviets also had China to worry about. The Kuomintang had actually won the Chinese Civil War here. That meant the Chinese Communist Party never came into true power. But even the Kuomintang didn't last too long. In 1995, China officially became a liberal democracy, meaning they had a lot more in common with the US than with the USSR. This was also around the time where the Soviets really stopped treading lightly. They were beating America in the space race and were now trying to beat them in the nuclear arms race as well. When China established democracy, the Soviets took this as a direct threat from the US and claimed that they were trying to impose their will on the rest of the world. Even though China had come to this consensus all on their own, the Soviets used this as an excuse to bolster their nuclear arsenal even more. Things were starting to become very dangerous. In response to this, China also increased their own nuclear firepower and officially allied with the US. This move was highly contested by the Western European countries that remained free, notably the UK, France, and Ireland. They claimed that this would cause the Soviets to try and officially invade them. The situation started escalating even more. In this timeline, the Americans hadn't gotten a man to the moon until 2001. The Soviets did it 2 years later, in 2003. The problem was, they had set up their moon base dangerously close to the US one, only about 200 meters away. They claimed that this was by accident, but nobody believed them. Things really started going to shit in the winter of 2007. France had been keeping the details of their own nuclear arsenal under wraps in order to avoid spite from the USSR. But all of their plans were leaked by a Soviet spy working discreetly in Paris. To them, a hidden nuclear program meant war. They moved into France just a month later. News about the invasion spread across the world like wildfire. The Soviets ordered that the French give up their weapons and sovereignty, becoming part of the USSR, but they didn't comply. The invasion lasted 3 months and would eventually be recognized as the inception of the apocalypse. The US, along with the UK, Ireland, Korea, and China, all sent troops over there to aid the French. This is when they realized that the Soviets had been keeping secrets of their own. With such a large portion of their national budget going towards the military, they had developed new ground war weapons that caused ungodly devastation. Things like automatic rifles with explosive rounds, power armor, electric bombs, noxious gas that would spread too fast to be anticipated, etc. Because of this, the Soviets managed to take France with minimal casualties, even with international help. Things started to look terrible. In 2011, they followed up by forcibly annexing the UK and Ireland. They even moved into the Middle East, destroying all of America's already established military bases there. World War III was imminent. About 3 years go by where no major occurrences take place. The Soviets knew that if they made a move on China, the US would be right on their heels. In addition to that, they would also be backed by Japan and Korea, which unified the same year that turned China to democracy. The peace didn't last. The following details were murky. All that can be confirmed was that when the Soviets decided to simultaneously send troops to China and America sometime in 2014, the nukes started flying. The East Coast and Midwest of America were destroyed, along with central Canada. All the provinces in western China, as well as the entirety of Korea, were destroyed. The Soviets also suffered heavy casualties. Ukraine, Belarus, and a quarter of Russia were irradiated. In addition to that, there were also some botched nuclear strikes that went haywire, hitting North Africa, India, and Central America. The world population plummeted that day, all in a nuclear war that lasted less than a day. An estimated 2.8 billion people died. The hundreds of cities were destroyed. The radiation ended up killing even more. The years that followed were miserable for everybody involved. The Soviet Union disbanded almost immediately after the war, and the mass rebuilding of countries and cities went underway. Everybody tried to recreate a sense of normalcy in the world, but it could never really be the same. The apocalypse had essentially occurred, but that wasn't even the worst of it. In 2015, a high-ranking Soviet general was found hiding in a town in eastern Germany. His name was Elias Richter. He didn't put up a fight when apprehended by the newly formed International Commonwealth. His trial was set immediately and televised all across the world. During the entire duration where the judge was reading out his war crimes, he remained stone-faced. That was until the very end. As he was about to be led to the electrocution room, he burst out laughing. It was a hysterical, nearly sadistic laugh. Everybody watched in shock as he began to speak. This was the gist of what he said. Apparently, the Soviets have been developing an extremely experimental weapon since 1964. It was to be projected to be finished around 2035, but the sudden breakout of nuclear war caused them to consider deploying it then. They held a vote within a 7-person committee involving some of the top scientists who had been working on the weapon at the time. A vote on whether they should use it or not. All 7 scientists voted against it. They claimed that the weapon was unfinished and therefore too unstable to be utilized, that it could lead to unfathomable consequences if something actually went wrong. The plan was seemingly scrapped. That was until Elias decided that that wasn't an acceptable decision. Most everybody, including his superiors, tried to stop him, but in his intense, psychotic, militant desire to win the war, he started a mini coup with a group of like-minded soldiers and launched it to the dismay of everybody. So what was this thing? Well, it was an antimatter weapon, a particle missile or something to that effect. The details of what it really was remained a mystery for all time. The world would only know of its consequences. This one weapon was enough to wipe out the entirety of America, most of Canada, and all of Central America as well. It was the endgame for the Soviets. With the US out of the picture, China likely wouldn't be able to handle them on their own. But something went terribly wrong. The launch was botched and it landed somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. Everybody in the courtroom went into collective shock as he said this. If a weapon of that magnitude exploded underwater, then that could mean the apocalypse wasn't over. But Elias was quick to correct them. Supposedly it wasn't an explosive, it was something else. Something that humanity wasn't ready to understand. It wasn't supposed to blow up America. It was supposed to get rid of it. He also didn't know when or if it would activate. But if it did, that would be the true end of the world. He didn't elaborate on what that meant, and his laughter started up again, but it quickly turned into desperate sobbing. Tears streamed down his face as he repeatedly muttered out the words, "I'm sorry." They interrogated him for a few weeks after that, trying to squeeze any info out of him, but he just sat there and said that he couldn't help them anymore. They even tortured him, but to no avail. He died in 2018. The world feverishly scouted the Atlantic Ocean for years, but the task was seemingly impossible. They had an imprecise location and they didn't even know what they were looking for. That was until 2022. There was an object about the size of a small car lodged into the seabed somewhere in the northern Atlantic. The first thing that they saw was the red and yellow of the USSR flag. This was it, but nobody knew what to do with it. Upon closer inspection, the device almost seemed alien. Nobody wanted to risk touching or operating it. Things still weren't looking good. It was in the summer of 2026 when a breakthrough finally came. An American physicist and cryptologist by the name of Daniel Buchanan had discovered how to sift through the general logistics of the weapon without activating it. And in fact, he'd found something interesting, but it probably wasn't what he or the world was hoping for. There was a countdown timer embedded somewhere deep in the code of the device. It read, 11 days, 7 hours, 53 minutes, and 22 seconds. This thing was set to go off in just over 11 days. The world fell into a frenzy. Everybody was at a loss for what to do. Beyond discovering the countdown, Buchanan hadn't managed to discover an off switch or how to even begin to defuse it. It was just too complicated, and he was the brightest that the world had to offer. As the days leading up to the inevitable started winding down, a mass evacuation into underground shelters went into place all over the world. Nobody knew what was going to happen. People were still trying to defuse the weapon just 4 hours before it was set to go off, but they had made zero progress. On top of that, the space programs were absolutely devastated, so they couldn't even launch it off the world. A few military aircrafts overlooking the Atlantic stayed out in order to provide a live feed of what was about to happen. The helicopters didn't notice anything during the first few minutes after the timer hit 0, but then they realized something. The ocean's surface was getting farther and farther away from them. That wasn't even the weirdest part, though. The water was also getting darker for some reason. They soon figured out why. Something was rising above from beneath the ocean. It was a landmass, an unfathomably large one. As it ascended towards them, they got a good enough view of the surface. It was nothing that should have come from this world. The structures, plants, creatures on that place, they all looked absolutely alien. The helicopters decided to take off, fearing what else could happen, what else they could come face to face with. But as soon as they started flying off, a wicked roar could be heard coming from somewhere right below them. The pilots frantically shouted a few words before the feed turned into static. Now, only the top-ranking government officials ever saw this, so the general populace was still in the dark of what was happening on the surface. Again, nobody knew what to do. There was no way in hell that the depleted world militaries could have any hope in quelling whatever the hell had leaked into the world. So they just waited. But for what? Nobody really knew. At that point, the history became hard to track. There were scattered reports of strange occurrences happening in the shelters. Things like the ground splitting below them, strange creatures breaking through the ceiling above, and even other people morphing into otherworldly beings. The last recorded document present in the library was sometime during 2035. This is all that it read. We can't stay in here anymore. We just can't. The air's getting thinner down here for some reason, and we've been hearing these fucking moans coming from somewhere below us for months now. Yesterday, the floor started cracking and a bunch of fucking eye stalks poked out of the rubble. They retreated back once we shot at them, but we know that it ain't over. We've decided to leave soon. Franklin's setting up a 9-person unit to map out what the fuck is happening on the surface. I'm a part of it, but to be honest, I don't have high hopes. I was floored after hearing all of this. I mean, I had no idea what to make of it, you know? What the hell are you supposed to think about something like this? God. I asked him about the library as well. It looks so nice, I don't see how they could have built it in such a place. He said that they didn't. Apparently, they'd stumbled upon this settlement about 4 years ago, and when they got here, nearly everybody was dead. The ones that were still clinging on to life told them the password. They told them that the history could not be lost forever. Somebody had to know. This is so fucked. If those documents were accurate, it means that the world in this timeline was essentially ruined by one single person. I'm gonna need some time to process all of this. Entry 45. Shit. I don't know what's going on right now. It's the middle of the night and I just heard the loudest sound ever coming from somewhere outside. I can't even describe it. I know that I'm pretty lucky to be alive at this point, but I don't think this is sustainable. Wait. I hear gunshots now. Shit. Entry 46. Well, it's been crazy since that last entry. This is what happened. At first, I thought about just hiding in my bunker when I heard the commotion outside. Just wait it all out, I thought. But then I realized something. If this settlement was destroyed, and I was the last one left alive, well, I wouldn't be lasting long after that, would I? And conversely, if I decided to hide and they won, then Crane and the rest of the guys wouldn't be too happy with my cowardice. I made my decision, grabbed the assault rifle under my bed, and decided to head out there. If I died, then I died. Was this life really worth living anymore? As soon as I poked my head outside, I was hit with the sharp smell of metal. I looked around, seeing blood everywhere on the ground, but no bodies. That's when I heard a deafening sound coming from behind me. I turned, seeing what looked like a massive humanoid walking around. And when I say massive, I don't mean 10 feet tall. I mean over 100. It was picking up soldiers and crushing them in its gargantuan hands before slurping down their entrails. And its face, well, it didn't really have one. Its entire head was just one giant spherical mouth. As I watched it, I noticed that it had scaly skin that seemed to be shedding off as it moved. But no, it wasn't shedding. There were things falling off of it. I watched in horror as they spotted me and started crawling towards me. As they got closer, I recoiled in horror. They were humanoids, crawling on all fours. They looked feral with sickly gray skin, like the giant behemoth that they came from. Their heads were also just one large mouth. They also seemed to be emitting some black gas that I didn't want to risk breathing in. I shot down about 4 of them before seeming to attract the attention of the big guy. I thought I was screwed. It leaped towards me, but I managed to duck into a nearby warehouse. After scrambling around in there for a few seconds, the creature ripped the roof off and tried swiping at me. Fortunately, I rolled away just in time, but I sprained my ankle in the process and was left trying to scoot away helplessly. That's when I noticed something extremely disturbing about this thing. It had eyes in the back of its throat. They seemed to be connected to some kind of appendage as it bulged out at me. I locked a vision with it for a second before it reached out again. Not knowing what to do, I just closed my eyes. But instead of feeling my body being crushed, I heard an explosion followed by an ear-splitting, unnatural roar. I opened my eyes to see that one of the creature's giant eyes had essentially burst open. Another rocket from an unknown source hit the creature in the chest soon after. While it was distracted, I managed to get away. I must have killed 3 more of those smaller creatures before I ran out of ammo. I was limping around, trying to find somewhere to go. That's when I saw the pit that I had encountered when I first got here. I don't really know why, but my mind started racing and I hastily made my way towards it. Once there, I collapsed and peered into the murky mist below. Oh, wait, mist? Or was it fog? It looked so familiar for some reason. Another roar from behind me caused my mind to sift through my memories even further. Why was this so damn familiar? And then it hit me. How we first got here. Rust, the plane. The fog under the clouds. At that moment, I could swear that I heard something coming from the pit. Was it birds? I was hearing a bird chirp. I felt the ground start shaking from behind me and knew this was my last chance. I pulled myself over the barricade and into the pit. I couldn't tell you how long I fell through the gray void. All I know is that things went suddenly dark at one point and I felt an impact. But it wasn't hard at all. The area around me was soft and wet. I felt my hand come into contact with something slimy squirming around and got worried for a second. But that's when I saw what it was. An earthworm. The stuff around me must have been dirt. I started looking around frantically, trying to place where I was. Eventually, I spotted a light above and started crawling towards it. I was on what seemed to be an upwards incline, so the climb wasn't too hard. Eventually, I broke out and found myself in a place that felt alien to where I had been for the last few years. Nature. I was in some kind of forest and had just crawled out of a hole in the ground. It was foggy as hell, but I could see the trees, the bushes, the shrubs, the birds, all of it. I lay down for a while and fell into a state of euphoria. I guess somebody thought I was crazy and walked over eventually, because I heard a voice speaking to me some while later. I opened my eyes to see a middle-aged man looking at me with an extremely concerned look. "Are you all right? What in the bloody hell are you doing?" He had what I assumed was a British accent. I would later find out that I ended up in Wales, in Cardiff to be exact. I tried to make up some story in my head, but it all came out in a jumbled mess. He walked away soon after that. Can't really blame him though. I must have looked and sounded like a madman. Eventually, I found my way out of the forest and onto a city street. I stumbled upon a public washroom and cleaned myself up as best as I could in there. I wasn't really sure what to do beyond that, though. I sat outside on the street for a while, even though I had no sign. I was tossed some change here and there. Eventually, I'd mustered up enough cash to buy a bag of chips and a prepackaged sandwich at a convenience store. It tasted like absolute heaven. I devoured it in the store, right in front of the cashier. I guess he saw my filthy, tattered jacket and my general unkempt appearance and felt sorry for me. "What's a young guy like you doing homeless already?" he asked me. I made up some story about how I flunked out of college while still owing massive student debt, and that my parents wouldn't take me in anymore for that reason. I guess he bought it because he offered me a job and a place to sleep in one of the back rooms. I started yesterday, but I still had my suspicions about the world, so I did some research at a local library. I've got to say, though, the internet's changed quite a bit while I've been gone, cell phones as well. It's kind of insane, actually. I've got a lot of catching up to do. Anyhow, my research yielded history that seemed to align with what I remembered, so that's excellent news. Out of curiosity, though, I searched up my parents' names. There were a few articles that came up. My dad had died in a workplace accident, and my mom, well, she had died a few years later from an apparent prescription drug overdose. Maybe it's better for me to not think about that too much. Actually, I think I'll end this entry for now. Entry 48. I'm currently on a plane headed to Burbank. After that, I'll need to head over to Sacramento. I'm not really sure if James still lives there or not. Hopefully, he does. Entry 49. As it turns out, he was still there. I really wasn't expecting it, but it's great. Even better was that he welcomed me with open arms. God, he hasn't changed at all. As it turns out, his parents have moved back to Australia, and they've left him the house here with all the mortgage paid off. Lucky bastard. But I'm not sure how I was going to approach our first meeting in around 7 years. Obviously, I had a lot of explaining to do, but I wasn't sure if I was going to tell him the truth or not. Eventually, I decided to. I could see the shock and disbelief on his face as I told him what had happened to me. But I could also tell that, deep down, he really believed me. He knew that I had no reason to lie. I barely got through any of my story before I felt the drowsiness hit me. James was nice enough to offer me a bed here, and that's where I am right now. I guess I'll continue explaining everything to him tomorrow, but for now, I'll rest. Entry 50. I told James a bit more about where I'd been before he had to go to work. But now that I'm here alone, I'm left to contemplate something that I don't really want to do. You see, before we left, Rust had told me to do something in case we ever got separated in that world and I found a way back here without him. I would need to go back to Caltech. There was this one lecture hall where he'd hidden something in a secret compartment in one of the walls. There were supposed to be 1 or 2 items in there. A box or a box and a note. If there was no note and only a box, that would mean that he had not made it back to our world. If that was the case, I would have to deliver the box to a specific address. It was his family. Now, as eccentric as Rust was, he still loved them deeply, enough to ensure full financial stability for them before he left. But he didn't tell them the truth about where he was going, just that it was a business trip. He always assumed that he was coming back, but it turns out that that wasn't the case. I went to Caltech in order to retrieve the box before coming back to Sacramento. I found it, but my heart dropped when there was no note. I opened the box to find a handwritten note directed towards his wife by Rust, as well as some addresses. He told me that after I'd delivered the box, to explain everything to him, and to tell them that he was truly sorry. It looks like I'm gonna have to do that soon. I've never been good at breaking bad news. Entry 51. James, this last entry is for you. I know that you're probably confused right now, but the best way that I can explain all of this is if you read this journal. I'm about to head off right now. I've taken some items from your home in order to help me on my journey, but I promise that I'll get you back later. You know I'm good for it. I'm sure that I'll see you again, my friend, but it might not be any time soon. You see, there was somebody else Rust had told me to contact if he didn't come back. He was a physicist who had known Rust since they were in college, but he wasn't based in Caltech. He worked for the government, for the higher-ups, if you will, although he was also interested in the notion of a parallel reality. He wasn't ready to take on Rust's offer when he told him about his discoveries. It just sounded too far-fetched, and he didn't want his superior to think that he was crazy. If I ever came back, Rust wanted me to convince him that it was real. Now, I always thought that this was an unreasonable request. After all, how was I supposed to change his mind? My journal entries probably wouldn't have even helped. I could have made it all up, but I found something in my jacket pocket that I had somehow forgotten about during my hectic stint on Heaven's Curse. It was a small piece of one of those shards that we had mined in the prison. I'll go to the other address, the physicist that Rust had given me in order to demonstrate the shard of myself in front of him. I don't see how he could doubt me after that. Hell, he'll probably even give me a job. Because, hey, you see, even though I never want to go back to that place myself, researching it from afar is still something that I want to do. Despite all that I've seen, all the places I've been to, there are still so many questions that have been left unanswered. I feel like it's my duty to find out, and also to find Rust, if he's still alive in there. Well, that was it. That was the end of the journal. What am I supposed to think about it? I don't really know. But I guess that the world out there, it's a lot bigger than I had originally thought. And I'm not so sure if that's a good thing. Hey everybody, Nightmares Nightly here. I just want to thank everybody for taking the time for listening to the series, and I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, the best way to help the channel is to share it with somebody you know. And a big thanks to the author, Mr. Outlaw, for allowing his stories to be narrated. And as always, thanks for listening, everybody.